Welcome to the NC Everything Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis, and this is the bi-weekly show where I talk about everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. Thank you all for joining me today, or whatever day you're listening. I do appreciate it more than I take time to mention. Today we're going to be talking about Orton Plantation. That's what North Carolinians call down east, although it's right on the coast, so that might just be coastal. Anyway, if I was leaving the Piedmont area to go to Orton, I would say I'm going down east. Before I get into it, I just want to say if you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Check out the Facebook group for more NC Everything content. And if you're only listening and you want to watch, you can find me on YouTube. And if you're tired of seeing me and you only want to listen, I'm found on most podcast players. I think most people are listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Now, this show here, I hope I got a good show for you, but my wife asked me yesterday if I had all my notes ready for my next podcast. And I said, yeah, I got everything ready. Turns out I didn't. I only thought I had everything ready. I had read a couple articles on Orton Plantation, and this week at work was really busy. This week at home was really busy. And in my head, I was all ready to go. And so I typed up my notes about 12 hours ago for this show. So anyway, I hope I can give you a good one. Orton Plantation. Orton Plantation is a historic plantation. Well, it's a history podcast, of course, a historic plantation. We don't build plantations anymore that I know of. But Orton Plantation is in the Smithfield Township of Brunswick County. It's located right beside the Cape Fear River. And if you Google it, I mean, literally the fields end on the edge of the riverbanks. And it's between Wilmington and Southport. But really, and it comes up in my notes later, it's a mile from Brunswick Town. And I've covered Brunswick Town in episode 18. And the last thing before I get into the history of Orton Plantation is considered, according to my notes, the perfect example of Southern antebellum architecture. And it's one of the oldest structures in Brunswick County. So the story of Orton Plantation really starts in 1725. So in 1725, a guy named Roger Moore, his family moves from South Carolina into North Carolina into an area that people call Orton. And this area, Orton, most of the land here was already owned by Roger's brother, a guy named Colonel Maurice Moore. So when brother Roger moved up to North Carolina with his brother Maurice sells him some of the land. Well, they get together and have this idea to build this new town, to found this new town called Brunswick Town. And so they do. They build up Brunswick Town together. And I won't go into Brunswick Town too much. Again, check out episode 18. It wasn't as successful as they had hoped, but they did build this little town and start this little farm. And again, the farm was about a mile away from Brunswick Town. The house he originally built in 1725 was attacked by Native Americans and destroyed. I tried to figure out why. I'm not real sure exactly why. But again, in 1725, I'm not sure if the why actually matters. We were more or less invading Native American territory anyway, so why wouldn't they burn it down, I guess one could say. But they did. They destroyed the original house in 1725. About 10 years later, Roger Moore would build a new house, the plantation house that we know of today as Orton Plantation. And at this point, he started growing tons of rice out here. And eventually, with the help of a lot of slave labor, he would become one of the leading rice producers in the colonies. Now, the plantation would stay in the Moore family until it was purchased by a guy named Benjamin Smith. I couldn't really figure out what year Benjamin Smith purchased it, but he didn't own it very long before he was forced to auction off the home and the surrounding 4,975 acres. Now, again, I don't know when the Moores sold the property, but in 1826, after what's his name? Benjamin Smith. After Benjamin Smith was forced to auction off the land, it was bought in 1826 by a physician named Frederick Jones Hill. And then at some point after 1826, Frederick Hill sells the property to a guy named Thomas C. Miller. And this is where the original home started changing a little bit. The house was originally 1.5 story. It was a 1.5 story white brick building. In 1840, a second floor was added, along with the 4 fluted Doric columns. So if you Google the house, it has these 4 giant columns in the front. that wasn't part of the original design. Those are added in 1840, along with the second floor. Now, like in most of my history episodes, I talk about the Civil War, and we can't avoid it in every history episode. The Civil War took place starting in 1861, and Orton Plantation made out okay. You see, after the Union Army attacked and took over Fort Fisher, they moved into Orton Plantation, into the mansion, and they used it as an army hospital. Because they were using it as an army hospital and offices, this spared it from being burned to the ground. Now, after the Civil War, the house essentially stayed abandoned for 20 years. Nobody lived there. Nobody took care of the place. Then in 1884, a guy named Kenneth Mackenzie Murchison, he buys the place, and he was a former Confederate officer. He restores Orton Plantation to the way it originally was. And I'm not sure what all the details to that was. I don't know if it meant originally in 1725 or originally before the Civil War. But he restores the whole place and makes it his winter home. Well, in 1904, Murchison dies, and the property goes to his daughter and son-in-law. And this was James and Luola Sprunt. And they had ideas for remodeling too. So, starting around 1910, they first built this giant flower garden, which I heard is pretty impressive, and they added 2 wings to the house. So again, if you look at a picture of it, you got the 4 columns, you got the main house, and there's 2 wings going off to the side. These were added early 20th century. Now, what's kind of sad, around 1915, they built a chapel on the property, and it's not small. It looks like a large church. But it wasn't long after that, Luola, she died of scarlet fever, so they renamed the chapel Luola's Chapel. Eventually, James would remarry, and after a relative was in a car accident, I'm taking she wasn't killed, but she was maimed pretty good. After this accident, they opened the gardens up to visitors, and they would charge people an admission to see it, just to kind of raise money. And they would charge 25 cents a person to come in and tour the gardens. And in that first week, they made over $1,000 of 1930s money. And so from that point on, they kept the gardens open to the public. Then in 1954, the Sprunt family donated 114.5 acres of the Orton Plantation to the Brunswicktown Historic Site. So they already had Brunswicktown Historic Site, and 114 acres of the Orton Plantation became a part of that. James Sprunt dies in 1974, and the property goes to their 4 children, James, Kenneth, Samuel, and Lawrence. And the Sprunt family owned Orton Plantation all the way till 2010. So the plantation stayed in the Sprunt family for 126 years. Now, I say it stayed in their family till 2010. During most of this time here, especially in 20, 30 years leading up to 2010, it was a huge tourist attraction. So people would come in, they'd see the gardens, they'd tour the property. Movies and TV shows were filmed there, which I'll talk about in a little bit. It said in here that it was a huge place for conservationists and bird watchers to hang out. And pictures I've seen and looking at on Google Earth, it does seem pretty impressive. But in 2010, the Sprunt family sells the property to a guy named Lewis Moore Bacon. 2 things about Lewis Moore Bacon. He was a descendant of the original owner, or the original builder, Roger Moore, but he was also a billionaire. And he was a conservationist. So he didn't buy it just to own this big property. He's actually in the process of restoring it and doing studies on growing rice, and he's doing a lot of conservation work down there. However, he did close it to the public. So now you can't go see Orton Plantation at all. It's absolutely closed to the public. And though it's kind of sad that, for right now and for the foreseeable future, we can't go tour Orton Plantation. I'm glad at least this billionaire isn't, trying to necessarily capitalize on it. It sounds like he's got some good ideas. So at least it will be protected. It's not going to turn into some kind of, rich man's mess, I guess you could say. And the last thing I have on Orton Plantation, I mentioned it was on movies and TV. It's kind of a cool story there. 1983, American movie producer Frank Capra Jr., he was looking for a place to film his movie called Firestarter, based off a Stephen King book. And I remember seeing Firestarter when I was a kid. I remember it scaring the shit out of me too. And when I was a kid, and this girl, we're close in age, close enough in age. She's a little older than I am. But the movie Firestarter features Drew Barrymore. When I was a kid, I had a huge crush on Drew Barrymore, and that hadn't actually changed all that much. She's still a big crush of mine. But I remember in Firestarter, her character scared the shit out of me. And I do remember a huge fire at the end of the movie. It was like an explosion and fire. Well, that explosion and fire was Orton Plantation. And no, they didn't set fire to the actual building. I actually seen some cool footage of them building a replica Orton Plantation to explode and set on fire. But the thing was, after Frank Capra Jr. filmed Firestarter down here at Orton Plantation, he thought this area was great. And so he goes into Wilmington and opens up a studio. And he also gets rights to continue using Orton Plantation for movies and TV. And this was like the beginning, really, of the film, the Hollywood boom, I guess you could say, in North Carolina. And now, they say North Carolina's the Hollywood of the East Coast. It was Firestarter at Orton Plantation that really kind of kicked off the movie industry in North Carolina. And so now, at the time my notes were taken off the internet, it says 23 films and 34 television movies and series have used Orton Plantation. And some of the movies and TV, of course, Firestarter, Lolita, The Divine Secrets of the Yaya Sisterhood. I remember seeing that. Don't remember much about it. Hound Dog, I haven't seen that. A Walk to Remember, in my opinion, a terrible remake or a terrible adaptation of the book. Personal Villains there. Sorry if that's a hot take. I did see Walk to Remember, obviously, but I don't remember Orton Plantation that. Television series includes One Tree Hill, Dawson's Creek, Matlock, and Heart of Dixie. Now, I don't know if a lot of you got on the Virgin River kick when that was the thing. I thought it was stupid, but I got hooked on it. I will admit, I'm embarrassed, but I thought I was hooked on Virgin River. So once we wrapped up Virgin River, I told my wife we need something else like this to watch. And Heart of Dixie was one of Netflix's suggestions. And I had never heard of it. I don't even remember when it was on, but we watched Heart of Dixie. And again, we binged that show till it's now dead. But Heart of Dixie, the mayor of the town in Heart of Dixie lives, in this big white mansion that is Orton Plantation. And that's kind of what actually made me decide to go ahead and use Orton Plantation for some podcast fodder. So I don't know if you've seen Firestarter or Yaya Sisterhood or I do my notes down, any of those shows. But if you watch Heart of Dixie, pretty much every time there's a scene with the mayor, there's some sort of romantic music or whatever, and it shows the front of Orton Plantation, and the interior. I think I read they filmed that somewhere else, so they just got a bunch of outside shots of the mansion, to show. Okay, now we got a scene with the mayor coming up. But that's all I have on Orton Plantation. This is usually where I say, hey, I suggest y'all go down here and see this. I'm gonna go try to see it too, but again, that's not going to be in the cards anytime soon. But if you are interested in plantations, though, I meant to make a list of some plantations to suggest to you, and I forgot. There are some very cool plantations and old historic farms all around North Carolina. So there's certainly a bunch to pick from. And I mean, not just North Carolina. Plantations are a huge thing in South Carolina. I know this is the NC Everything podcast, but you can definitely find some very beautiful places in South Carolina, and I'm sure you can find some good places in Virginia if you're okay with getting the speeding tickets for no reason. But anyway, that's all I got. I hope you enjoyed the show, and again, if you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe. It helps me out. Check me out on YouTube. Check me out on Spotify. And if you need more NC Everything podcast, definitely go to the Facebook group. And I guess that's everything. So I will talk to you. Look, I messed that up. I'll talk to you in a couple of weeks.